the world on January 19th, 2025, and the world on January 20th, 2025, unrecognizable. Holy crap, I'm in this kind of vortex of weirdness when I come back here. I live in Vietnam, in Ho Chi Minh City, Vietnam. I feel that when I come back to the United States, that Americans feel discombobulated, that as a people, all of the social contracts that we have taken for granted over the past 50 years that I've been alive are broken. And then at the same time, we see China kind of coming up. China now is out-innovating us in e-commerce. China is out-innovating us in automotive. China is out-innovating us in so many different ways. In many cases, we're a tech and finance economy, and China has basically decoupled from that. And again, China decoupled from that, not the US, but there is really no more West. That concept has broken apart.
We have very different viewpoints on many things.
But a lot of these issues are American issues. They're not Republican or Democrat issues.
Welcome back to Elevated Thoughts. Today, we have the honor of hosting Mr. Eric Olander, the editor-in-chief of the China Global South Project, who, through his work, sheds light on how countries across Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia are navigating China's long-term investment strategies in these areas, while also how these countries are balancing their relationship with the collective West and us, the United States. So, Eric, thank you so much for joining. How are you, my friend?
Charles, Mike, great to be here. Thanks for having me on the show.
Yes, well, we are very excited to have you here. We've been following your work as we've been interviewing more and more people that are interested in China, concerned with this shifting global power dynamic. And that's why we wanted to bring you on, because you are a major voice in this space. And with the China Global South Project, am I saying that right? China Global South Project.
China Global South, or CGSP.
Yeah, CGSP. We wanted to know how you got into it, and basically over this hour interview, learn what you have learned and what you can share with our viewers.
Well, I'd be happy to tell you a little bit of the background, but we definitely have to afford some time to talk about what's going on today, because what's going on today, particularly around China and Trump and Europe, is absolutely consequential to everybody right now. My background is that I started studying Chinese in 1985, before you guys were even a twinkle in your parents' eyes. And I was in high school.
Correct.
And I was in Massachusetts, and they had a Chinese program, and they had a radio station at the school. So for me, that was the chocolate and the peanut butter that kind of came together of journalism and China. I didn't know at the time, but that was the foundation of it all. After high school, I did a gap year and went to Taiwan, and this was 1989. And there's some real parallels to 1989 and 2025. November 9th, 1989 was one of those days where the world pivoted on its axis. That was the day the Berlin Wall came down.
Right.
I had an internship in a radio station in Taipei. And it was at that moment when I was just saying the energy from seeing the wall come down and everything that was happening in 89, the Soviet Union collapsing. And again, the world on November 8th and the world on November 9th were totally different. Just the same way that the world on January 19th, 2025, and the world on January 20th, 2025, unrecognizable. So some interesting parallels there. And so I caught this bug of wanting to tell people about what was going on in the world. And I got internships, and from internships led to entry-level jobs, led to, correspondent positions, led to producer positions, led to the alphabet soup of news agencies, so CNN, AP, BBC, NPR, France 24, I was the editor-in-chief. I ran a large Asian TV station in Los Angeles, and bounced back and forth between Asia and the US, and a little bit in Africa as well, just going wherever the best jobs were, most interesting kind of correspondent assignments that were. So I covered, basically mostly focused on China. And so for about 15 years, spent in Hong Kong, Taiwan, and mainland China, traveling all over the country. And I got to see China back in 1989. That was the first time I went. When right after Tiananmen Square, so about 6 months after Tiananmen Square, the bullet holes were still in the square. They hadn't actually even filled them in yet.
You can't censor that. Wow.
No, there they were. And what was amazing is being in China in 1989. This was one of the poorest countries in the world. This was a country that at the time I stayed with my host family had food rations. So on Mondays we got rice, on Tuesdays we got oil, on Thursdays we got some beans. You got these coupon books that you had to go around. There was no color in the country. Everybody wore black, brown, gray. They were on bicycles. It was drab. And so I feel so privileged in my life over the course of seeing it from 1989 all the way till today to see China in what it is. Now, we can disagree with how China's developed and what it's become, and a lot of people here in the U.S. are threatened or they don't like it. But what you can't disagree is that hundreds of millions of people have moved from below subsistence poverty to now the second largest economy in the world that in many ways is out-innovating pretty much everybody else. And to watch that trajectory in one lifetime is absolutely remarkable. So I'll stop there. I mean, I got a lot more we can go on in different directions, but China for me was the transformational force of the late 20th century and certainly into the 21st century, right up there with climate change, AI, and now we have this great power competition.
So I think what's really important is most folks, especially at least in the West, and then especially in large media outlets on the other half of the world, they always think about it in the lens of, what does this mean for China? What does this mean for the U.S.? And I guess this is exactly the purpose and the mission of your podcast and your newsletter is giving these other countries a voice. So I guess let's put down some questions for the layman. What exactly is the Global South? Who are the major players in there? And, why do they deserve a voice, right?
Okay. Let's start with the first part of your question about the West. What do you mean by the West?
Well, typically, that means, at least in my mind, I'm thinking especially the EU and America are the largest players in the upper West.
And that is completely smashed to pieces now.
Right.
Okay. So I don't
specifically 2025.
But they've been pulling apart, particularly on China, for quite some time. I mean, Xi Jinping goes to the head of Volkswagen, which is the largest automaker in the world, with Toyota back in their number 1 and 2, and they jostle back and forth. And he says, do you want an auto company half your size? Do you want Volkswagen to be half its size? If you don't, you got to play ball according to our rules. So Germany's industrial sector is tied to China in many ways that is very different than the U.S. In fact, many U.S. businesses over the past 20 years have been pulling out and have been pulling back. It's one of the reasons why attitudes in the U.S. towards China have hardened a lot is because the stakes aren't really as high anymore. There is no more Google. There is no more Microsoft. The finance companies have been pushed out. In many cases, we're a tech and finance economy, and what we sell is tech and finance and services. China has basically decoupled from that. And again, China decoupled from that, not the U.S. I mean, early on, it kicked out Google, it kicked out Microsoft, Yahoo. That was not a U.S. thing. Those companies really wanted to be a part of China. So this line that it's the Americans that are decoupling from China is not entirely accurate. But there is really no more West. That concept has broken apart. Now, when we talk about the Global South, this is a really, really painful topic to talk about because we're talking about more than 100 countries, totally different geographies, cultures, languages, experiences, histories. What ties them together are the exclusion from the elite clubs, the exclusion from the G7, the exclusion from access to capital markets, the shared traumatic experience of colonialism is oftentimes a bond that binds them together. These are very weak links that bind them together. These countries all have their own national agendas. They all have their own agency. They all respond to international events radically different. There is no cohesive kind of grouping of the Global South, but we struggle to find a word that would describe these in a way that, would be accurate. So we looked at, people say the global majority. That's certainly applicable because not all the countries that we're talking about are in the South. China considers itself a Global South country, yet it's in the North, Also, we have a question like Australia. That's a weird country. On the one hand, it's very much part of the Global West, but on the other hand, it behaves like a Global South country because it's primarily a resource exporter. It's very much engaged in Oceania and the South Pacific, so it's consequential to the Global South in ways that, say, Liechtenstein is not.
Right.
Singapore, the same way. Singapore is the highest per capita income of any country in the world, and yet it's very much part of the global south. It thinks of itself as part of the global south. So this is a really murky, bad, terrible term, but it was the best of the lot that we had to go with. We looked at maybe calling it the Belt and Road Show or something like that. And then we were like, they're going to think we're Chinese propaganda. No, that's not going to work.
Right,
and the Belt and Road is something that's changing and evolving. And so we kind of settled on China's relationship with the global south. And the reason why we nailed down this one is because when you hear from people in these countries, they refer to themselves as the global south oftentimes. In Indonesia, in India, in China, there's talk about South-South cooperation, South-South engagement. The G77 plus China is a global South organization that during their meetings, they're always talking about it. So I figured, let's lean into how they talk about themselves as a word rather than something that we would impose on them. But it was a tough decision to come to that name.
I can imagine. Yeah, coming up with a name for the podcast, we rolled around with that for a while, but we landed on Elevated Thoughts.
That's a good one, too.
So coming into this interview, Eric, I will be honest, I thought that we were going to be saying how China is this adversary and we need to be very wary. And that's been quite a few of our interviews over the last couple of weeks and months. But as I was reading some of your materials preparing for this, it seems like their military buildup is not really in line with what the United States is doing. It seems like their messaging is kind of like, we're not going to do anything crazy right now. We're just building up defense. And I'm curious if you can help me understand, how come we see this as such a big adversary? Are they just happy-go-lucky?
No, they're not happy-go-lucky. They are very much an adversary of the United States. I think that's a fair way to look at it. I think that the way that China is seen from the U.S. is highly distorted. I think that we see it through our own, experience and our own prism, and it's hard for us to kind of see. We don't understand the logic of their power. So the same way that, and I'm helping my son right now with his World War II kind of education, and we're reading these books together. And one of the things that they said about the rise of Hitler was the British and the French didn't understand the logic of Hitler's power. They didn't understand the way he was approaching things. They assumed that Hitler would respect the rules and the existing status quo because that's what you did. And Hitler broke all of the norms in warfare, in diplomacy, in international relations. And in many ways, and I'm not comparing China to Hitler at all, what I am saying is that there's a misreading of the logic of power. We don't fundamentally understand in many cases, and we have very good China knowledge production in this country. So the China experts, the China scholars are second to none in the United States. The problem is the mainstream discourse about China oftentimes eliminates that nuance that is so critical. And so China is in many ways, and Xi Jinping himself is in many ways, Trump before Trump. This is about make China great again. They do not want to replace the United States as the global hegemonic power. They do not want to have their fleet patrol the South Atlantic to patrol the in the Suez or the Straits of Hormuz to make sure that oil shipments are passing through fine. They do not want to set the agenda at, in some kind of remote part of the world that doesn't have any bearing on their own national interest and their national security. They are very focused on what benefits them and them only. Okay? So this is a very different type of power. So when you hear the Americans say that the Chinese want to replace the United States, the evidence just isn't there to support that narrative and that line. That's our insecurity speaking, that we feel threatened that somebody wants to replace us. What they want to do is they certainly want the Americans out of Asia, and they want, that is a top priority, is out of the South China Sea, out of Japan, out of South Korea, to kind of stop caring about Taiwan. That is their number one priority more than anything else.
Right.
But remember that the Chinese have benefited enormously from American public goods, global public goods. All that oil that flows from the Middle East to China flows under the protection of the U.S. Navy, keeping everybody at bay. They have benefited enormously from Japan and South Korea not becoming nuclear powers in the post-war era. They have benefited enormously from the creation of the U.S. dollar as the global reserve currency. They have benefited enormously from our debt markets that they were able to park almost $1 trillion of cash. So this is not about overthrowing the Americans. It's about making the system more accommodating to them as the world's second largest power. So there's nuance in that. So it's definitely adversarial. I'm not sugarcoating that. It's just not this binary us and them.
Got it. Yeah, no, I've noticed China is very good at doing what benefits them most, right? Whether
That's
it be trading with Russia or trading with America when the terms are good. I think what's really important for folks is, and it's within the context of what's going on in American politics right now. There's a lot of tough negotiations surrounding trade, and I think what it's important to note is the differences in style, or at least the differences of what is on offer. I guess how does Chinese foreign policy differ from, say, the more recent braggadocious American trade policy, and even comparing that a little bit under the Biden administration? Because I think it's kind of like when you go down to your car lot to go pick out a car from the salesman, right? The experience is kind of important. What is the experience difference between those two countries?
Well, I mean, to be fair, we're still learning what the America First foreign policy is going to be. This is so new. I think there are very few people who have a firm grasp of what it is and what it isn't. This is not something where there's a lot of literature on how Trump is approaching this. I mean, Trump 1 and Trump 2 are so radically different from one another that I think it's misleading oftentimes to use Trump 1 as the basis for understanding Trump 2.
Exactly.
We did not have in Trump 1, overt, calls for imperialism to acquire massive territories in Greenland, in Panama, and in Gaza and other places like that. So, and again, I say this with an open mind that we're still learning about what U.S. foreign policy is today and what it's not. What we do know, and what I am firmly convinced of, is that the world the way it was is never coming back again. That is, the U.S.-led multilateral system is over. Marco Rubio, in his Senate confirmation for Secretary of State, was very clear, and he said that the liberal world order, the liberal international order, has not served the United States well. The U.S. feels that being the global hegemon and paying for the global public goods in order to provide $1.99 T-shirts at Walmart and $2.89 gas in Kansas has not benefited Americans enough. And that the irony is that we hit our, we talk about bringing manufacturing back to the United States, but we're a manufacturing powerhouse. We're just not using very many people to do it. The threat to the American worker is less China and Vietnam and more technology. Technology and automation have wiped out capitalism, but technology and automation have wiped out way more jobs. I mean, just look, go to your frickin' supermarket, okay, or the CVS, and you're self-checking yourself out, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's a job that used to do that. That job isn't there anymore.
Sure. How about Amazon warehouses?
I was about to say, Amazon distribution centers,
what I was going to say.
They're all automated. So, we just don't need as many people. I mean, I was looking back, and in the 19th century, something like half the U.S. population was in the agricultural sector. And we have about 2% of the population today in the agricultural sector that produces infinitely more food than they did. So I think there's a conflation in the U.S. oftentimes about who to blame. And technology is a harder thing to blame than the Chinese or the Vietnamese. Now, let's be sure, Bill Clinton bears some responsibility here, okay? Because Bill Clinton lied to us. He said when he signed NAFTA, that when we sign NAFTA and the auto companies pack up out of the Rust Belt and go to Mexico, we're going to come in with huge training programs, huge education programs, upskilling. You're not going to believe what the American worker is going to be able to do. And that was a lie.
Right,
and then he told us when, they got rid of Glass-Steagall, the banks and the investment banks, that the American worker is going to benefit from that. And that led to the housing crisis. So our politicians have contributed to this through Democrat and Republican lies that go back decades. And now we're at the end of that cycle where there's so much cynicism towards the government that people are willing to just burn the government down now because they're so disillusioned from it. That's a very different place than where China is today.
Right.
China's institutions are strong, are robust. Now, there's a lot of problems in China. Let's be really clear.
Oh, yeah.
Xi Jinping is in trouble. He's got an economy that is incredibly weak. He's got an economy that has very, very robust unemployment. He's got an overcapacity problem, which he's producing way too much crap to sell domestically. He
And a
doesn't
good
have the
amount of
consumer
public debt. A good amount of public
well,
debt.
not even, the public debt is interesting. The public debt on the provincial and the city government level is one of the three major problems that he faces. The other two is that he faces a declining population that is rapidly shrinking. None of my friends in China want to have a second child because it's simply too expensive. There's a credit debt for the individuals. Consumer debt in many Chinese markets is even more than it is in the United States. People are racking up huge credit card debts and payments there. And then we've got a demand problem, and then he's got a massive property crisis problem. Because the way that local governments generated wealth was not by taxing their people or through property taxes. It was by selling land that was then developed. But that's a house of cards, because if people don't have the money to buy the land, then the government can't sell it, and then the property companies are leveraged and they're falling. And what we have now is this real financial crisis. So Xi Jinping doesn't wake up every day thinking about the U.S. That's a big problem that we have in the U.S. We center ourselves in everything we do. He wakes up every day thinking about the crisis in his own backyard economically. And that's a very different thought perception than many people here have, because we think it's about us, and it's not.
You mentioned that they have very strong institutions, and we talk a lot on this show how there's this continuance of governance between the Democrats and the Republicans, where our institutions kind of steer the ship to a certain degree. But as of late, and my evidence is Elon Musk gutting U.S. aid and all of our foreign dollars that have been sending out.
Yeah.
Institutions has become a dirty word, right? And when you talk about Trump's populism and this kind of thing, we want to kill institutions. At least I represent the right on this show, and I don't know if I feel that way, but we can't say it. We hate institutions on the right.
Yeah.
So is that the same sentiment they feel in China?
No. By the way, this is a more or less a uniquely American phenomena that we're seeing right now.
Yeah.
That bureaucracy and governance and state capacity and systems are something that countries actually aspire to build, not to take apart. And I think, I've lived in developing countries now for much of the past 25 years. And I think Americans are going to start learning a very sobering lesson now of what it looks like when you have limited government, of what it looks like when you have institutions that don't function well, and what it looks like when you take the guardrails off of corruption and bribery, which is, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act has been eliminated, and many of the anti-corruption laws have been wiped out in the past 6 weeks. I live in a country where there is no FDA that monitors food. There is no USDA that monitors the meat supply. There is no one that monitors the pesticides in the in the food that you buy at the market. There is nobody regulating any of this stuff. And that's what weak government looks like. And, we're heading in that direction. And the UK in many ways is a couple of years ahead of us. Their institutions have been corroding with effectiveness over the past 10, 20, 30 years as well. The national system of health in Britain has come down. They privatized a lot of their rail system. It's not performing as well. And what you've seen is just increasingly lower and lower levels of economic performance. And yet you go to places like Sweden, Singapore, Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, China, where institutions and the regulatory state is very strong, very, very strong. And yet you see very strong economic performance as well. We have, again, run into this problem where institutions have been politicized beyond the point where we can agree what their function is and whether they're useful or not. And that is, I think that's going to lead us into some very difficult times ahead, because institutions are very important to support business and to support growth and to support an educated society and to equalize and levelate, some of the differences in society. And, we don't know how far we have to fall and how fast it can fall until it's actually happened. And I fear that's a little bit of what's happening here.
Before you go on, Mike, because I know you have a question, I've been saying that I'm giving Elon Musk the benefit of the doubt, right? Let's stop all the funding. Let's stop all the spending, but give it 2 days and then revisit the important programs and maybe turn them back on. And I'm hoping that that's kind of happening. I saw him in the Oval saying, we were doing Ebola research. Obviously, we wanted to keep that. And I'm like, oh, okay, maybe is some discerning evidence here.
Remember, and you guys might be too young to remember this, but, the Clinton-Gore camp, when they were in office,
Right.
Gore led a reinventing government initiative that reduced government employment by 400,000. Remember, the Clinton, administration balanced the budget. That was the
Right.
last time they balanced the budget. But they took a very slow, methodical way
Correct.
of doing it. And again, people say they want government to be run like a business. I run a business. This is not how I would run things, okay?
Right.
And I know Elon does this, but let's be honest. Elon took Twitter from $44 billion to $9 billion, okay? He's doing something similar with Tesla now. I think we're never going to see Tesla sell more cars than it did last year, ever again. It's finished as a brand in terms of being a global brand. So I think if we look at Elon, and that's not a value judgment, that's a fact. And I'm here in Berkeley, California, the most liberal, progressive place where they had more Teslas than you can possibly imagine a couple of years ago, okay? They are disappearing fast here. And the bougie people of Berkeley, exactly. But if the bougie rich people of Berkeley stop buying $80,000 to $120,000 Teslas, I'm like, where's the market? Because red America isn't going to buy EVs. We know that.
Right.
It was Santa Monica, Berkeley, Portland, Seattle, Austin, Boston, Westchester. They were buying all the Teslas. They don't want to be seen in a Tesla anymore. So
and I think it was more than just the fact that they were driving an electric vehicle, right? There was the brand recognition. You felt like you were doing something good with it.
It was cutting
That's why
edge,
you would spend
and it was
that exorbitant amount.
And they loved the software, and they loved the fart noises that the Tesla made. They loved telling their friends, and when the Tesla did the dance, the windows go up and down.
Correct.
That was all great, cool stuff. And so there was but again, Elon as a business person, I think the story isn't over yet for him. I think it's too early for us to say whether or not he is the ultimate genius in business, because this may end tragically. Let me give you a little story. I got a note today from a friend of mine who's a political analyst in Vietnam, and I live in Vietnam. And he told me today, so the Vietnamese are going to they've announced they're going to let Starlink in. And the Viettel, which is the national telephone company, the monopoly, is run by the military. Okay? It's a military monopoly. And they're the dominant player. There are some others, but everybody's under Viettel.
Got it.
Viettel is pissed off as hell that they have to make way for Starlink, because it's competition that they didn't want.
Right.
But the political imperative now is to make the Americans happy so that they don't tariff the country. So obviously the political leadership went to the military and said, guys, this is not the hill you want to die on. Okay? And what the analysts said is the moment that Elon and the U.S. are weak and stumble, they're going to pull Starlink. It's, this is not a long-term solution on how to force your way into these countries by putting a gun to their head and saying, you're going to take Starlink or else you're going to get sanctioned with tariffs. That's not a long-term solution. That will give them a sugar high for the next 3 to 5 years. But the moment Trump's out of power, guess who the military in Vietnam, what they're going to do? They're going to say, can we swear in this show?
Yes.
Absolutely.
Okay. They're going to say, F you, we're going to take our monopoly back, right? I mean, we know this because they're forced to do it right now. This is not something they wanted to do.
This is one of my gravest concerns, because I am all for, and I'm a big fan of something like the Inflation Reduction Act, which was very adversarial towards other economies. Is heavy subsidization in American, interests, and perhaps judged by other countries as almost unfair levels of subsidies combined with some tariffs. But I think people miss the mark on what's going on with these tariffs. I mean, just the whipsaw that we've seen in the last week, and there's memes afloat everywhere. Tariffs on, off, on, off, on, off. I mean, what does this do to these long-term relationships? Because whether it was Republican or Democrat in office, there was kind of this general direction that they used to see. But now that you have other countries on offer, like China entering, this global market, saying we're offering something more stable, like you said, is this really like such detrimental harm to our long-term relations?
Oh, I cannot overstate. I mean, how long do you think it's going to take for Canadians to believe in us again? This is a generational wound that is being set in there. Okay. Let's say the White House flips in 28. Let's say. And President Gavin Newsom, I know, I'm just saying that to annoy all of your, I'm just going to annoy all of your viewers with that one, okay?
Yeah, I joke all the time just to rile people up.
This is just to rile everybody up.
If Biden runs again, I'm voting for him just to piss people off.
There we go. But but I think what would rile them up more is slick Gavin Newsom.
Absolutely.
Okay, so Gavin Newsom, President Newsom goes and says, America's back. Now remember, Biden said America's back.
Right.
Trump just said America's back, but we're going to be back for a third time. Okay.
Right.
And if you're Europe now and you have just watched the Americans take the side of Russians in what many Europeans feel is an existential threat. If you're sitting in Estonia, Lithuania, Poland,
right.
This is not academic. Okay. And by, putting Ukraine on basically the sacrificial altar in order to secure a deal is something that is causing generational damage for certain parts of Europe that used to be incredibly loyal to the Americans. Poland in particular, very pro-American. By the way, Colombia was one of the most, and Panama were the most pro-American countries in the region that had resisted the shift leftwards that Brazil and Honduras and other countries had gone. They too are just like, Jesus Christ, this is not, we're not, we're angry. And so here come the Chinese. And the Chinese actually don't have to do very much. They just show up and they say, everything's the way it was. Everything is stable. Everything is good. You want to do trade with us? Awesome. We're going to buy more of your materials. You want to sell some more to us? That's fine. We're good with that. By the way, at the UN, we're going to line up with you guys at the UN, which happened on the Ukraine vote. You're interested in the Belt and Road and you're interested in some of these things. Now, the Belt and Road, we can talk about that, and it's worth talking about, is under threat in many reasons. We saw what happened in Panama, where the Americans forced the Panamanians to withdraw from the Belt and Road. Mm-hmm. And my suspicion, the conversation went something like this between the Panamanian president and the Chinese ambassador to Panama City. He says, the president probably said, listen, I got to do this. I got a gun to my head. I got to do this. It's not what I want to do. Leaving you has not been something we've enjoyed this relationship, but I got no choice. They can cut off my dollar supply and my entire economy just evaporates overnight. The Chinese ambassador probably said, I get it. It's all good. Don't worry. 5-10 years, things will be different.
Yeah.
They'll be back. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
This is not a permanent shift. They're out of the Belt and Road today. And my guess is the Americans are going to squeeze 30 to 40 countries out of the Belt and Road. They're going to look across the geography, and they're going to look at a country like Dominica. Not the Dominican Republic, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
There's a little tiny speck of an island in the Caribbean called Dominica. 75,000 people. Never heard of it. 75,000 people. Member of the Belt and Road. But yet depends on the U.S. for most of its trade. That they're going to force, and they're going to put a gun and say, you got to flip. Same conversation will happen. We'll be back. This is not a shift. This is like the Vietnamese military.
Mm-hmm.
The moment comes when Gavin Newsom comes into office, everything will kind of go back a little bit in some respects. And again, I'm saying that to rile up your viewers. I don't think Gavin Newsom's going to win the presidency.
Hey, we see it with Trump's announcement for tariffs against Mexico and Canada. It was one day, then he has a phone call, and okay, the tariffs are off the table. Actually, we paused them, and we'll talk to you in a month. And now, actually, we're going to exclude MCA, and they're doing a lot to prevent the fentanyl spill into the country. And I looked into that. I want our viewers to know, the the Americans apprehended 44 pounds of fentanyl coming into the United States, whereas I think it was a factor of 1,000 more went into Canada from the United States.
This doesn't feel like it's about fentanyl. This feels like there's deeper grievances here on the part of MAGA towards Canada and towards Western Europe. This is the cover for it, but I think the motivating force for Trump to pull back on these tariffs, because he did this twice now in 6 weeks, is nothing to do with Mexico or Canada. It has everything to do with Jamie Dimon on Wall Street saying, you're about to shed about $1 trillion off the market cap of American companies. This has everything to do with Ford, GM, Stellantis, telling him, like, you're about to send, 15,000 auto workers out of work right away in core constituencies. I think there's the sobriety of the economic impact of these changes. Now, here's why Trump is dumb, okay? Trump has a moment right now where he's got Congress literally licking out of his palm. He could pass anything he wants in Congress to make it law. I mean, it is unbelievable. He's got this three-seat advantage in the House. That window may not be there next year.
Right.
I think when we look back on this, these executive orders are the cheapest form of legislation you can possibly make, because everything can be reversed with the signing of a pen the next time around. This is saccharine, okay? The mistake that Trump is making is that he didn't take advantage of Mike Johnson in the Congress to say, let's put this all into law.
Right.
And then it's really hard to undo that out of law.
Yeah.
And I think he could have passed everything on a majority vote. On maybe not everything, but a lot could have been enshrined in law, taking advantage of this compliant Congress. And even some Democrats may have gone along with some of this stuff if he hadn't come out quite so aggressively.
Yeah, very interesting.
And I feel that it's just so much just a play to the base, and it feels good on its surface, but most folks aren't really looking into it. I mean, remember, this is the guy who the problem was inflation, right? We got to get rid of Biden because, and he actually said it in the State of the Union address, I inherited this, economic catastrophe. But then he's going on and promising the following day, or even in the same breath of that speech, is like, oh, it's going to get tough for a little while. Inflation might go up with all these measures. But how does changing the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America lower inflation? And this is what drives me crazy.
That's a culture war thing. But I'm going to challenge you, Mike, on one thing you said about that he's playing to his base. One of the things that's different between Trump 1 and Trump 2 is that the impact of these cuts is hitting his base much harder than it's hitting bougie Berkeley here. Okay, let me just be very clear that when they shut the education department, all the rich white folks here in Berkeley who send their kids to $35,000 private schools, they don't care. That has no impact. They don't have public lunches. They don't have subsidized, they don't have class sizes that are 45 to 55 kids. When, he's going after veterans, he's going after farmers, he's going after teachers in red states that depend on these institutions way more than the rich blue areas that have all the cash. That is something different than Trump 1 and Trump 2. They, in my view, do not look like a party that is going to run for re-election. They are not acting like a party looking to go for re-election. That's the part that is very curious, because you would think that they would be taking resources from bougie Berkeley and shifting them to Mississippi.
Right.
They're not doing that. And when he's talking about $80 billion of cuts out of the Pentagon, that was not on my bingo card either. Because the Pentagon was sacred. Do you know what I mean? Like, you could cut every DEI program in every part of the country, but you know what? Pentagon stays, no matter what.
Right.
Congress used to do, every year, State Department would go in with their request. They would trim it by 10%. Pentagon goes in with its request, they boost it by 5%. Like, you don't even need the money, but we're going to give it to you. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And that was the way it's always been. I mean, $982 billion, defense appropriation is just massive. So, but these are things, this is where, again, we're in new uncharted territory. They're going after their base as hard as they're going after anybody else, which is, I didn't think that was going to be the case.
So there's a young woman out there named Kyla Scanlon. She's kind of a Gen Z influencer. She's someone that one of our friends follows, and she's in the finance industry. So she's kind of been reporting on this situation and kind of how, very despondent about what's going on and saying things that you're saying. I don't think people realize that where these cuts are going to hit you until you see it, a little bit down the road. I don't know what the answer is to kind of how to deal with Trump, right? Because I think you have a lot of Democrats at the State of the Union speech making themselves look silly. I think I understand what their objective was to not normalize this, but I think it kind of fell on its face. And I think his name, the political strategist James Carville, I believe
James Carville says, "Just wait, sit back, let this unfold."
And I'm kind of in that boat, because I don't think people realize how much, as you were talking about before, how much money flows from the blue states through these programs, through the Department of Education to these very, very poor areas. I'm in Florida, and I could tell you how fragmented the public school system is. And there's some towns it's very, very great, but in most towns it's very poor. So once you enhance that school choice program, once you start robbing these schools of funding, it's only going to get worse, and you're going to get, that it's the
But
base.
they don't seem concerned about it. They just don't seem concerned about it. Even Republican congressional representatives, they're not going to do any more town hall meetings. They don't seem that concerned about it. So
let me speak for MAGA, because I said this to Jeff Wise last week, who is a journalist, and he was speaking about, he dislikes Trump. He's saying we're in a totalitarian society. But I basically said,
which we're not, by the way. That's a misreading of what totalitarian societies actually are.
And
so
actually, he may
be
have
careful.
said
that word gets
another word, to be
okay,
fair.
fair enough. But
exactly.
But
he might have said dictator. But
I live in an authoritarian society. This is not an authoritarian society. So
Well, my response to him was, we didn't abolish democracy. We actually uplifted democracy, because the MAGA base, the people, the popular vote who voted for Trump, their mandate, as Trump and J.D. Vance are calling it, was cut all the freaking funding. And that's what they went ahead and did. So that's part of it, right? People aren't seeing two levels of HUD where they're going to feel the impact.
Be careful. The Trump coalition was very diverse. 35% of the base of that vote was exactly what you're talking about. That's the hardcore MAGA that says burn it all down. Sure. But to what Mike was saying, there were, remember, he only won the popular vote by 1.5%. Okay. There were probably about 15% of that who said, you know what? I don't like the way things have been. I don't like the Democrats. I hate Biden. I don't like the overregulation. I'm not really that in with Trump, but I'm going to give him a shot. That
only 15?
I would say probably between the 35 to the 51 or the 49 that he won. He didn't even win a plurality. Do you know what I mean? He won, he just, again, was only a percentage and a half. And look at even the congressional races were quite tight. It was not as wide as they're making it sound out to be. That's also what Carville is saying, is that they're misreading their mandate. They're going too far, too hard, too fast. So whatever that percentage is between the base and the electoral victory, that 1.5%, that is predicated on two things. One, that they see results. Prices come down, services go up, their quality of life get better. At this point, that's still in doubt. Let's give him the benefit of the doubt. Charles, I hope this works out. I've got,
likewise,
I've got a 401k here, and I mean, Jesus, I'm hoping this works out. Okay.
Yeah.
Because we all suffer if it doesn't work out. But the conflict of interest that Elon has, when he's doing this, is how other people don't see that in unelected bureaucrats. And here we have Doge with, big balls running through, the bureaucracy cutting things. I don't know. I mean, that just doesn't feel like it's sustainable the way it's going like that. But also bear in mind that Democrats sat on the sidelines because a lot of them didn't like Kamala Harris. So low turnout was a big part of the Trump win. And I think that's something to take into account. So if, the Democratic primary generates, coming out of the midterms in late 26 into 27, the Democratic bench is pretty deep. There's a bunch of governors who are good. There's a bunch of people who are out there ready and who have been, so I'm kind of on the Carville side, which is just sit back and wait. What would you do now? What strategy? I mean, it's happening too fast.
Yeah.
You need to see the impact of these things to be able to respond to. Once we start to see the hard impact of these cuts, that is this summer when people go to the national park and they can't get in because there's a 4-mile long, run, way, or, Uncle Bob had a heart attack and there was no ranger to help them. Once class sizes go from 25, 35 to 55 kids in a class, that's what the Democrats should run on. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
When you have something tangible. Right now, it's just kind of like, grasping at things,
Sure.
We spoke with Jeff Wise. I just mentioned him, but he works on locating the lost Malaysian flight MH370.
Yeah.
And he relies a lot on drift data that is produced by NOAA or NOAA. And I brought that up at my office, and someone goes, "Are you serious? I follow their data. I use their weather forecast."
They want to cut NOAA.
And they
want to privatize it.
800 people. And the insurance companies use it too. But meanwhile, you hear from all of Mike's neighbors in Florida, the red state, that they can't get insurance anymore, right? But now,
and that's here in California too, by the way. We can't get insurance.
Yeah, so you guys are very prescient in this. I think that there's going to be some trickle down negativity here. And,
no, I think. Yeah. I mean, this is going to be bumpy to say the least. Does it all implode? maybe not. Or do we become like Britain after Brexit, which is just kind of mediocre?
Yeah, that's my
Do you know what I
biggest
mean?
fear.
That's kind of where nothing really works. You know what I'm amazed is that I often go to Singapore. Singapore, if you haven't been, is just like,
It's on
the
my
best
bucket list.
infrastructure, the most advanced. You want to go get your pharmaceutical information on a phone, QR code, bam, they give you your things at the pharmacy, you're out in 2 seconds.
That's awesome.
I went to CVS the other day, understaffed. Everybody has to go through an interrogation of, oh, does your insurance cover this? Oh, did you show me your insurance card? And it's a 5-minute transaction for each person to process their prescriptions. The lines are long, and it just kind of pointed me to, this is maybe the future of America, which is it works. The stuff is okay, but it just doesn't work that efficiently. And people are frustrated, and it's kind of slogging along. But I just want to make it very clear that Americans still have a perception that we are the most advanced society in the world. We are the envy of the world. We are the most, technologically, modern, and that is not the case at all. Our infrastructure is vastly behind that of Japan. I mean, even a second or third tier Japanese city is orders of magnitude more advanced infrastructure-wise than any of the most advanced cities here.
One of my favorite vacation places is Spain. And my God, I tell you, I love the high-speed rail. I'm able to get to any quarter of the country in 2.5, 3 hours. And then their local metro systems are just worlds better than ours. And that's even though compared to New York City, where I used to live near before. And I mean, it's incredible, but it's not quite as clean and efficient as European cities.
No, and Japan, China, South Korea, Singapore, Taiwan, Dubai. You got to go to these places to see. And people will say, well, is it really any better anywhere else, guns or healthcare or any of them? And you're just going to be like, yeah, no. It really is. And again, this is not to shit on the U.S. This is just to put the U.S. in context that if we don't invest in infrastructure, we don't invest in education, other people are.
So while the U.S. pulls back in a lot of areas of the world, and I having read one of your articles recently, it seems like China has learned at least some lessons from the first Trump presidency. And I think it's pretty interesting, and I want to get your opinion on this and what's going on in Argentina, right? So I had the pleasure of visiting Argentina when Milei won his runoff election. That was a very interesting time over there. And he's a very interesting character. He's the first libertarian elected to major government in the world. It could be Milei or Malay. I'm probably butchering it.
I'm not sure. I'm not Hispanic in that way. So yeah,
I'm going to trust your pronunciation, whatever you said. But
I don't know. But you
way,
said Malay. I thought Malay. But okay, we'll go with we get it.
How to pronounce Javier Milei? Javier Milei. Javier Milei.
We're going to go with
Argentina.
We're going to go to the Argentinian president, Milei. So Milei, he's now a fan of Elon Musk showing up at CPAC, giving him the chainsaw for cutting through government. What I find very interesting, though, is that he's quietly trading more agricultural goods with China, which is exactly what our tariffs are generally targeting.
And remember that he came to office on the most anti-China platform. He was like anti-communist, anti-China. He called them the worst names.
So I worry if our strategy is becoming incoherent, right? Because I agree the overproduction crisis is a problem with China. They overwhelm certain rare earth and critical minerals markets to the point where they're the only ones able to do it. And I don't think those are fair trade practices. But when we talk about these crazy tariffs that really hit the American consumer at the end of the day, and we find that those same tariffs we tried to use the first time around, they're quietly figuring out new routes to replace those trade goods. I feel like we're just spinning our wheels here for the sake
quietly
of
doing
ulterior
it. They're
motives.
actively doing it. When I was I left Shanghai in 2019, and the first cargo ship of South African citrus came into the harbor, and they fired these fireworks over the ship to welcome South African citrus into the harbor. And I was talking to a Chinese government official at the time, and I said, "Why are you making all the fanfare for some citrus coming in?" He says, "Because we don't want to buy your citrus from Florida and California anymore." He says, "You cannot call us the names that you call us and expect us to turn around and rely on you for food." Okay?
Right.
You cannot call us an existential threat or an adversary or, all the things that Washington and Americans call the Chinese and then expect them to buy billions and billions from the farmers, right? That's lunacy from a strategic point of view to be food reliant and food dependent on your enemy, right?
Mm-hmm.
So they still buy a huge amount of food from the United States because China is a massive population. The United States produces more food than anybody else, so they have to. But there is a long-term strategic plan to shift away and reduce their reliance on the United States. So where are they going? They're going to the other massive food producers, and a lot of them are in South America. Brazil, Argentina, Chile, Peru. That's why they just built the Chancay port in Peru, a massive port that is going to connect and cut down by 21 days, cut down the shipping time, or cut down to 21 days, the shipping time between South America and Shanghai. And so so this move to buy beef and wheat and sorghum from Argentina is absolutely vital. Also, bear in mind, Argentina is one of the most dysfunctional economies in the world.
Right.
And China has provided currency swaps and financial support to Argentina. So all of a sudden, this is a little bit of an example maybe for Trump. The rhetoric met the reality that when Milei came to office, he realized that he couldn't follow through with his anti-China rhetoric. He had to be more accommodating. So the Chinese, they sat back, and they've learned from the Americans over the years. People are going to bloviate. People hate China, blah, blah, anti-China, Tiananmen Square, human rights, okay, blah, 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 but we need to buy your food.
Right.
So the business relationship went on. And so the Chinese have learned to separate the kind of harsh political rhetoric from the reality of doing business. The Trump tariffs do kind of change that equation because that impacts the ability to buy and to sell. So that's a different dynamic. So up until now, the Chinese have kind of separated the politics from the economics. That's starting to change. But there is a concerted effort to reduce their reliance on the United States. And by the way, China is the largest customer for American farmers.
I almost feel like Milei rose to prominence on rhetoric, and now he's doesn't matter. The same way that MAGA is ignoring the secondhand repercussions of all of these cuts and changes, right now, who cares? He gave a chainsaw to Elon Musk. It's all good. Everyone loves him.
I mean, but look at Viktor Orban as well. I mean, he came to power, same kind of way. And again, Hungary is probably one of the worst performing economies in the European Union. But maybe that doesn't matter. So, our future may be looking towards Hungary where, white, Christian, heterosexual nationalism is the dominant media meme, but yet economic performance isn't there. But maybe it doesn't matter. This was the thing that I didn't understand about Trump 1. Farmers were one of the biggest losers in all of this.
Right.
Billions and billions of dollars.
Billions.
And the irony of all of this is that these are the people that say they want to end welfare, they want to cut government subsidies, and yet $28 billion of your tax money and my tax money went to the farmers. And yet they turn right around to vote for Donald Trump.
Again. Yep.
So the logic doesn't always play out because maybe these are emotional issues that are driving a lot of these sentiments.
Agreed.
It's about status loss. It's about, this fear of, a transgender person going into my daughter's bathroom and, that is these anxieties. I feel that when I come back to the United States, that Americans feel discombobulated, that as a people, all of the social contracts that we have taken for granted over the past 50 years that I've been alive are broken. The social contract with the police, we don't trust them. The social contract with schools, we don't trust them. The social contract with the airlines, we hate stewardesses who enforce sit down and there's all these people screaming and yelling. You can go down with the healthcare system, with the government, any type of authority, the social bond and contract is broken. We don't have community because churches no longer were a secular society. We don't have after-school programs for kids. And so what ends up happening is there's this sense of dislocation. And then at the same time, we see China kind of coming up. China now is out-innovating us in e-commerce. China is out-innovating us in automotive. China is out-innovating of us in so many different ways now with DeepSeek. And so we have this fear that we used to be the best. We used to be number one. Are we still number one anymore? And I think that anxiety and that breakdown of the social contracts has led us to this point where people are just, and every political stripe is this way. It's not even a red-blue thing. Everybody's discombobulated. What's our place in the world? We don't really know anymore.
Hey, we're going to wrap up a little bit, but I want you to talk a little bit about BYD. You mentioned Hungary. They're going to get a plant, and a couple other European
Brazil's
nations
getting a
are.
plant. I mean, Indonesia's getting a plant. Vietnam's getting a plant. BYD is a force to be reckoned with. And by the way, you guys are missing something. Chinese cars are the best cars out there right now. I mean, the tech in these
Really?
cars blows your mind. You cannot believe they don't look at the cars as cars; they look at them as consumer electronics. And
Okay.
they're, I mean, it is just, I mean, the Xiaomi kind of Porsche copy is for 30 grand, unreal. And the
Can I
amount
buy
of
it
tech
today,
you
or
get,
is it
you
illegal?
can't not in the United States. You have to pay 100% tariff on it. So if you're
Right,
rich
right, right.
enough, you can pay 100% tariff.
Still,
I mean,
less
still-
than a Porsche, right?
No. I mean, and again, I hear all these people saying, well, they copied, and no. I mean, I used to work at Ford in China for many years, and they built this automotive business. You know, yes, was there copying going on? Sure. But I don't know. That copying argument to me is a bullshit argument, because look at freaking Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook and tell me the innovation that they've ever done, right? It's all
Yeah.
copying and pilfered off of everybody. That's
Right.
kind of the way that business, I mean, I live near Silicon Valley. There's not an original idea in Silicon Valley. Everybody, Steve Jobs copied the GUI from Stanford Research Park. I guess my
Right.
point here is that the copying argument is lazy, and it's usually people who are not informed. Chinese innovation is real,
Right.
and you see it in the automotive sector, and what they've done with 5G, what they've done with autonomous driving. They are way ahead of us. Their cars are awesome. We have them in my neighborhood in Vietnam. They're popping up everywhere. You look at them and you're just blown away by what you get for $50,000, $60,000. I mean, it's just nothing like what we have. And so it's unfortunate that you guys are missing out on this, and the American consumer's missing
Indeed.
out, because we're going to be driving kind of janky old ICE cars here, while the rest of the world is kind of moving on with electrification and connectivity,
Yeah.
AI, 5G,
Mhm.
infrastructure. So the idea is that you're going down the street, your car tells you there's an ambulance coming, 4 blocks away at the intersection, hold, because the 5G network's telling you that the ambulance is coming. That stuff is now. It's already it's already there. We don't have anywhere near that here. And so it is pretty exciting on transportation to see what the Chinese are doing.
Wow. Eric, I'm left speechless. I mean, I had complete different expectation coming into this episode, and I'm really grateful for the perspective, because it's
My
making me
pleasure.
think I have to revisit some of these conversations we've had, the books we've read, and almost reframe my thinking. I've been tweeting like, hey, they're building this $10 billion military base in secret over in Beijing or just outside. We need to be looking at this, but
Well, I mean, listen, they're a $14-15 trillion economy. They get to build a military that they can defend their economy. I'm not trying to justify anything, but at the same
Yeah,
time, I mean, the world's second largest economy is entitled to have military assets that protect its sea lanes and whatnot. And I think, let's bear in mind the Chinese have 1, maybe 2 overseas military bases right now. One is in Djibouti, the other one is in Cambodia. And I say maybes because the Cambodia one is a half a base, if you will, for the Navy. We don't even know for sure. But,
Got it.
we have 900 bases around the world in military installations. I mean, listen, this is not a comparison. We
we
have
have
to be
for sure.
reasonable here. And I
Here.
don't say that to defend the Chinese. I say, come on, let's be reasonable here. 900 to 1.5 is kind
Yeah.
of like, that's just an absurd debate that, and again, I think, the Japanese have more overseas bases than the Chinese do. They have a right to legitimately protect their interests in their sea lanes if they're working with other sovereign countries and these are mutually agreed upon, decisions. And so that's not a popular view in Washington, though. They feel that we have to stop them at every turn, which I get where
Right.
they're coming from. It's just not going to work very well.
So I'm a big fan of your work. I'm a subscriber, but
Oh.
tell our viewers of the show where they can
Yeah.
find you and
I
follow
mean,
you.
if you're interested in what we do, I've been a little bit more partisan today than I normally am. The mission of what we do at CGSP is to provide you and everybody else with, the anti-polarization on China. And particularly from a global South perspective. And so we try to call balls and strikes. I mean, we really do. And we try to keep the kind of extreme voices on this topic to the side, because we find that there's not enough just kind of middle of the road, old school journalism, just tell me the facts kind of analysis and reporting. And we also try to break away from the Washington kind of narrative and the DC Beltway thinking. So We have teams in Asia, in Indonesia, in Tel Aviv. We have teams in Nairobi, in Cape Town. We're just about to launch a Spanish language service. We do it in Arabic and French and English. We do a lot of data on Chinese mining. And again, we have zero agenda. We're not advocating for or against the U.S. or for or against China or for. That's up to you to decide.
Right.
That's we just try to give you the perspective, and then you decide. Sometimes it's critical of China. Sometimes it's positive. Sometimes it's kind of neutral. And same with the U.S. too. We look at the U.S. and China as complex actors. And what happens is that in our discussions like this, it oftentimes just gets flattened and reduced to China or the U.S. And that's kind of reductive. And so that's what we try and do. So we have monthly subscriptions, $19 and for a month, which we think is a good deal because one, we're independent journalism. We don't get any government support. We don't take any support from anybody who tries to influence our agenda. We don't take money from corporations. Like you, we're independent content creators, and so what we earn is what we make, and so and independent journalism today is more important than ever, especially because the mainstream media just isn't really that good anymore.
You could say that again.
I mean, they're just not that good.
Right.
And so we specialize in a tiny little niche of the world, but one that is absolutely transformational to everybody who's watching this show, is impacted by what China's doing in the developing world, whether it's for critical resources, whether it's for military, whether it's for these geopolitics we've been talking about. So check us out, ChinaGlobalSouth.com. I'll give you my email. I love talking with everybody, Eric, ERIC, at ChinaGlobalSouth.com. People are always surprised when they email me. They get long answers back, and I love doing that. So, and I get a ton of mail, and I've got about 1 million followers on social media, and a small percentage of that every day emails me. But I spend a part of my day engaging with people, and really just love having these kind of conversations that we had today.
Awesome, Eric. Well, this was fun for us. This was a real treat. So thank you for your time, and thank you for what you do. It definitely is important. We're all in this ecosphere of kind of restoring discourse, trying to bring a balanced perspective. And one of our buddies has coined it radical centrism.
Exactly.
So maybe you
radical
can adopt
centrism.
that
I'm going to take that if that's okay.
By all
awesome.
means.
Thank you, Dustin. Shout out. But actually, it's his birthday today. Happy birthday. He's 42.
Birthday, Dustin.
Eric, thank you again. This has been Elevated Thoughts.